Hello and welcome back to the channel. It's been a few weeks since my last video because I've been moving house and setting up this new studio space here, but I'm back in action now and I've got loads of exciting stuff to talk about, starting with these guys, the first 4 analogue modules from Expert Sleepers. Now these have actually been available for over a year, but the Eurorack world is so fast moving that they might have flown under some people's radar a bit. So the good folks at Signal Sounds have hooked me up with a set of them, and I'm going to dig into them a bit and show you exactly what they can do. Expert Sleepers are probably best known for their digital interface modules and their multifunction modules like the disting, so these all-analogue modules were a bit of a departure when they were first announced. There are 4 in the range so far, they're all 8 HP wide, and they're all the same price, that's £159, €154 or $189 depending on where you live. Lorelei is an oscillator, a VCO with 3 outputs, all with waveshaping. It's got linear and exponential FM and some very cool cross-modulation functions. Evo or Ivo is a low-pass filter with 2 or 3 pole mode, 2 inputs, 2 CV inputs, really great sound. Persephone is a VCA with overdrive, and it has a very cool zero crossing detector for clickless operation, which I'll explain in a bit. And finally, Beatrix is a phaser, which also has lots of cool modulation options. So in this video, I'm going to build 9 patches using these 4 modules in various configurations, and I'll walk through all the features that make them unique. As usual, you can use the timing index to skip around, and in the meantime, here's a quick preview of what's coming up. Okay, so to get started, I'm going to firstly focus on Lorelei, Evo and Persephone, the oscillator, filter and VCA. I'll come on to Beatrix in a couple of patches' time. I'm going to build up a simple subtractive patch using all these 3 modules, but first of all I'm just going to walk you through the key features of each of them. So starting with Lorelei, this is the oscillator. Going top to bottom on the inputs and outputs, we have volt per octave, pitch input, we have linear FM and exponential FM. The exponential FM has an attenuator. We have cross-modulation input, which I'll come on to in the next patch, and we have an input for the shape CV, which controls the amount of wave shaping for the 3 outputs. So we've got 3 wave outputs. One's a pulse, which can shape between a very narrow pulse to a square to another narrow pulse. We've got sine, which shapes to a kind of pseudo triangle, and we've got a cosine, which is 90 degrees out of phase with the sine, which shapes through to a kind of pseudo sawtooth. In terms of the manual controls, we have an octave switch at the top here. We have a fine tune, which goes plus or minus about an octave. That's the attenuator for the exponential FM input. That's the manual wave shaper control, and that's the attenuator for the shape CV input. So just to listen to the outputs, that's the sine on the bottom output, which shapes through like this to a saw. And you'll notice because of the way it shapes, it effectively doubles the frequency in the center. So it'll appear to go up an octave. There. Next up is the sine to triangle, and you'll see this one kind of rectifies. And again, you get this octave doubling effect in the middle, and you can see on the scope, you get this kind of quite sharp triangle at the bottom and a kind of saturated sine at the top of the wave shape, but it's unipolar. And finally the pulse, which is silent at extremes. And you get a very narrow pulse through square to another very narrow pulse and off. And with the CV input, you can get some quite nice PWM kind of effects going on here. Let's just take LFO. Up to audio rates. You get a nice range of metallic tones. I'm also a big fan of audio rate wave shaping the other outputs. You get a nice bit of variety just by tweaking the kind of initial offset of this shape. If you were to run that through a VCA, you'd be able to do some nice tonal shaping. Get some more aggressive sounds on this last one. So it's really nice for kind of animated waveforms straight away, just with that wave shaping control. And something else interesting to note is this octave switch is a continuous encoder, so it goes up and then back down to the bottom again. So you can just rotate it and it'll keep flipping through the octaves. Haven't actually thought of a performance use for this yet, but I'm sure someone out there will. Okay, so next one along is Evo. This is the VCF, the voltage controlled filter, which is switchable between 2 and 3 pole mode. Just to run through the inputs and outputs again, top to bottom, we've got 2 CV inputs for the cutoff, one with an attenuator. We've got CV input for the feedback or resonance, again with an attenuator. We've got 2 audio inputs, one of which has an attenuator, so you can mix 2 waveforms together, and then the 1 output. Control-wise, we've got the filter cutoff, we've got the attenuator for the CV input, we've got the feedback or resonance, the attenuator for the CV input for that, and we've got an attenuator for the second audio input, so you can control the balance of the 2 input signals. So if I just take the sawtooth wave from the oscillator, and I'll just do a couple of sweeps. So in 2-pole mode, this is it wide open, no resonance. And with the resonance up a bit. And a bit more. And a bit more. And it gets quite extreme as it starts to self-oscillate. See the oscilloscope's going a bit crazy with this. Now in 3-pole mode, it's a bit smoother. That's with no resonance, with a little bit more. And even with the resonance right up, it doesn't self-oscillate, doesn't get too screamy. So if you want slightly smoother sound design, 3-pole's really nice. Okay, the next one along is Persephone, the VCA, which has a couple of really unique features, which I'll come on to. Just to talk about the audio path, first of all, there are 2 inputs, which are summed, and there's 1 output. There are 2 gain stages. There's a pre and a post gain stage. The pre adds soft clipping, and the post stage is really to kind of bring the level back down to stop it hard clipping, or you can jack it up and hard clip it if you like as well. There's a clip LED that indicates that. There's also a bias control up here, which is at the initial level. So at the moment, with the bias fully up, no CV input, the pre fully down, and the post fully up, we should just have a unity gain. So that's the sine wave coming through. Now, if we were to bring down the post control and start bringing up the pre, you can kind of move these in tandem to keep the level relatively constant. You can see on the scope we're now getting this really saturated sine that's kind of squared off. And if I bring the post up even more, you'll see that clip starts to light when it gets to the clipping threshold, and it'll start to hard clip quite aggressively and get very square. So from this sine wave we can shape quite drastically. But for now I'm just going to leave it on the kind of conventional setting. And I want to talk about the zero crossing detector on the CV circuit. So basically, a problem which a lot of VCAs have, especially with very short envelopes, is and low frequencies, is that the envelope opens the VCA at a point that's midway through the oscillator's cycle, which gives it a kind of click where that vertical line is. And I'll show you what I mean. Here's an envelope. I'm just doing a very short decay envelope from stages, which has basically an instant attack. And I'm going to bring this bias control down to just below the point where any signal's coming through. I'm going to feed this envelope signal into the CV input and just bring this up. And you can hear, this is with the zero crossing switched off, hear those little clicks. It's even more obvious at a lower frequency. I'm going to turn this sine wave down another octave. And you can actually see, I don't know whether the frame rate will show it, but there's little vertical lines popping up on the scope there. If you turn on zero crossing, they magically vanish. And the way this works is, it samples and holds the CV that's coming into it, and the point at which it samples it is at the zero crossing of the audio input coming to it. So basically that sine wave, whenever it crosses zero, it'll sample the CV that's on the input, and it'll hold that until it crosses zero again. So you end up with a very high frequency stepped CV signal, which is not really audible, but it just means there are no pops or clicks. I'll just switch it off again. And you can hear those pops coming in straight away. You can take that sampled and held CV signal out from the CV out to use elsewhere as well, which is potentially really handy. Only other thing to mention on here is on the clipping stage, on the pre-saturation stage rather, this asymmetry control will allow for a slightly different flavour of distortion. If I turn that on, you'll see it kind of delinearizes it and skews it slightly positive on here, so we get this kind of slightly different flavour compared to the symmetrical distortion there. So we've got a nice low note pounding away. Let's put in a pitch sequence. And let's bring this wave up to something more interesting. And we can just do a conventional kind of pattern. Let's speed it up a bit. And there we've just got a pretty straightforward subtractive synth patch. And we've got no popping or clicking at all on that VCA. Nice clean sound. Okay, so let's move on to something slightly more advanced but with the same kind of basic setup. I'm going to look at the cross-modulation input, which is a bit like oscillator sync. But it's got a bit of a difference. I haven't really come across anything quite like this before. The way this works is you have a sort of master oscillator which comes into the cross-modulation input. In this case, I've got a pulse wave from this Danny Sound EM129 over here. With every cycle of that, it will reset the oscillator that's being synced, in this case Lorelei. However, when the voltage of the input signal is above about 3.3 volts, it actually stops oscillating. So what you end up with is this output waveform which resembles the pulse that's coming in terms of it being stopped when it's high, and when it's low you're getting the oscillation from this oscillator. Now you need to look at the scope, and probably best just to listen to this. So here I've got a pulse wave, which is pretty square in fact, and if I adjust the frequency in octaves of our Lorelei oscillator here, you can see this sine wave element jumping around. And if I adjust the pulse width of this master oscillator, I can get more or less of that in. And likewise, if I switch to a different waveform, like maybe a triangle, you get a different shape altogether, or a sine. So you can get these really cool sync-like effects, but with the input oscillator having quite a big impact on the sound, more so than it would in traditional sync, where it would just start it cycling again. So let's go for a kind of wide-ish pulse like this. And then of course you can shape the wave in Lorelei as well. And let's modulate this with an LFO. And let's pulse width modulate that clocking oscillator as well. So we've got two sets of related modulations there. I'm just using oct here to give me a bunch of LFOs. And let's now chuck a sequence in. Let's add another LFO to the resonance. And we can go one further. Let's go into the exponential FM input and sweep the frequency. Let's drive the VCA a little bit. And we've got an incredibly lively sound here just from chucking a bit of modulation at all these parameters. Okay, let's move on to Beatrix, which is the phaser in the range, and I'll just quickly run through the controls of the inputs and outputs, so then I'll start a little patch with it. So we've got audio in and out at the bottom with an attenuator on the input. We've got CV inputs for the frequency with an attenuator. We've got another CV input for the offset, which I'll explain in a moment. We've got CV input for the depth and for the feedback, and the depth and feedback have got controls of their own here as well. We've got a couple of switches, one which turns the phasing effect on and off effectively. Basically, the way the phaser works is it adds a phase-shifted copy of the input signal to the input, which gives it that phasing sound. If you disable the original, you just get the phase-shifted version, which means you can get some kind of peak filtering effects without the phasing effect if you turn that off. And then the sum switch here, it's got plus or minus options. That just controls whether it inverts the phase signal before it adds it back to the original, which gives you a slightly different flavour of phasing. So let's just play a square wave through the phaser with no sequencing. This is just a square wave coming from Lorelei through the filter and through the VCA, but with no real processing. And if I turn up the depth and then start moving the frequency manually, you can hear it kind of sweeping through that classic phaser sound. And if I've got an LFO from oct coming in here, if I turn up this attenuator, and if I turn up the feedback or the resonance, we get this nice kind of it almost gets to self-oscillation. It gets quite gnarly if you turn it right up. If we keep this depth down a little bit, let's bring this down again. So let's get some arpeggios going into this. I'll just bring that filter down. Get a bit of extra PWM on that square wave. variety, and let's just bring in a little bit of noise, which I've just got the noise output of the Turing machine here onto the second input of the filter, just to give it something extra to chew on. We've got that classic kind of swooshing phaser sound. If I bring up the depth even more. Just running the output of this through the effects pedal here with a tape delay, just for a little bit of subtle extra effect. Got the filter here in 3-pole mode, which is quite gentle. I'll just demo what the offset input does as opposed to the main frequency input. If I switch the CV signal there, that will basically move the frequency notches in the filter, but without moving where the resonant peak is. So if I turn the resonance up, I could tune that in with the frequency here. Just go back into the main frequency input for a second. And I'm just going to show you what switching the sum from plus to minus sounds like. So it's kind of a thinner sound, the filtering's a bit more extreme, depending on how the phase relationships are. Let's flick it back to plus. So there you go, nice classic synth phaser kind of sound. Okay, so next I want to explore the sound of pinging the Evo filter. Now, pinging a filter is basically where you feed into the audio input a very short pulse. The filter is set just below the point of self-oscillation, and what happens is that ping excites the filter core, and you get this kind of short, percussive little blip of sound, which sounds quite cool, and you can do some quite cool percussion stuff with it. So this is the filter oscillating. And if I just bring down the resonance or the feedback to just below the point of oscillation, and if I now start up the Turing machine, you can hear this nice little pulse. And I've got no melodic information going into it at all as yet. Let's just get this a little bit more aggressive sounding. It's going through the Persephone VCA. Let's give it a bit of drive. And I'm also running it through the Music Thing Spring Reverb just to give it a little bit of atmosphere. Now we can take the melodic output, the pitch output from the Turing machine into the filter cutoff. I'll take it into the one with the attenuator, in fact, and then just bring in a bit of that. And we get this little bit of atonal pitch info. Let's just unlock the sequence and then relock it. And one other cool thing we can do, I'm taking a copy of that pulse output into a sample and hold, the difficult R&D step. If we put that into the CV input for the resonance or the feedback control, we can actually make some notes slightly longer and some slightly shorter at random. So one of the things I like to try when I've got an oscillator with multiple outputs is to use an external switch or crossfader to audio rate switch between two of the different waveforms to create a new one. What we'll be listening to here, when I turn the volume up, is the two sine outputs going into the two inputs of a voltage-controlled switch, and the square wave used as the switching signal, and then I'm just playing the output through the output channel here. So with the wave shape in the middle, we've got the kind of pseudo-triangle and the sawtooth, and we've got a square wave switching between them, so we've got this kind of hybrid waveform, which as I move the wave shape will adjust the point at which they switch and the shape that they're switching between. So you can get some quite nice effects with this. You could also try switching between, using one of the other waveforms to do the switching. This way we're switching between the pulse and the kind of sine to triangle wave. And this way we're using the sine to triangle wave to switch between the pulse and the saw to sine. So we get some nice interesting shapes there. But things get a bit more interesting if we use an external oscillator which isn't synced to this one to do the switching. So let's go into... I've got this IntelliGel 1U VCO here, which I've already tuned to a sort of sympathetic frequency, which is giving us this nice kind of slightly buzzy, slightly phased kind of effect. Quite a complex waveform here, and as I adjust this wave shaping, you get some other quite interesting tones. So if I take this through a chain which I've set up and apply a bit of modulation, I've basically got a bunch of LFOs from Oct going into a matrix mixer, and I've set up 3 different combinations of those 4 LFOs. I'm using one to control the wave shaping, one to control filter cutoff, and one to control VCA amplitude, just for a bit of variation in volume level. So again, this nice kind of evolving drone. I've also got another LFO going into the phaser frequency, which I've just got turned up slightly, so it's going through the phaser as well. And if I turn up some reverb and start this sequence, you get this pretty epic, huge, evolving kind of drone sound. Okay, so this patch I was going to look at some types of FM on Lorelei and Evo. Kind of got it to this point and it sounded quite good, so I thought I'd just record a bit of this first. So what's happening here is Evo is the oscillator. I've got a sequence from the Turing machine, just playing in 16th notes. It's going through the 1U IntelliGel passive LPG. I've got a kick drum coming in from a 909 module in my other rack. I'm sidechaining the kind of synth part with the kick drum in the Danny Sound Dynamics. And I've got the pulse output of the Turing machine firing off occasional envelopes which are providing FM modulation to the filter. So the filter's oscillating and it's getting this extra bit of FM coming in on the second cutoff input whenever these pulse notes hit. And if I just play with the scale, and I can play with the VCA shaping a little bit as well to get some harsher tones. And I can just play with the Turing machine sequence, unlock it, get another nice rhythm. Instant techno, just add a ride cymbal now and you're laughing. Okay, so I've stripped things back a bit. This is the sine wave from Lorelei, sequenced by the Turing machine. Basically on every 16th note I'm firing a little AD envelope which is powering this LPG. I've got a tiny splash of spring reverb on it just to give it a bit of atmosphere. I'm quantizing the sequence through disting. And I'm taking a copy of the same volt per octave information into Evo's cutoff frequency, and that's oscillating, that's in self-oscillating mode. So if I take this output and plug it into the linear FM, and just tune this, you can get this kind of classic FM kind of slightly metallic. Now Evo doesn't track volt per octave quite as well as Lorelei does, so you're going to get these little imperfections which are quite nice. You can always calibrate it to be more accurate if you're that way inclined. I quite like having it a bit more random. When you get to lower ratios, it starts to get a bit noisy and unpredictable. You can find a few sweet spots, but it generally works better with a linear FM at this kind of ratio, which is a bit higher. Now we can also use the exponential FM input, which is going to be a bit more extreme, but this one has an attenuator so we can control the index of this FM modulation. Because this isn't through 0 FM, it's going to have quite a pronounced effect on the pitch, as you can hear. And again, at these lower ratios it gets a bit chaotic, but at these higher ones it sounds quite sweet. Tends to work better in this kind of range, a bit more musical. And what you can do to get a little bit more variety again is take another envelope from the pulse, driven by the pulse output of the Turing machine, which I'm going to use to drive the VCA. And let's put this modulation through a VCA so we're actually enveloping it as it goes in. You get even more percussive kind of sounds from this, and again you can sort of shape that modulation a bit more with the tone shaping here too. And you can try wave shaping the basic sine wave from here into something a bit more. Because we're driving this VCA envelope from the pulse output rather than every single 16th note, we're getting this kind of rhythmic accent thing. We could just take it from the 16th note and have it on every one. But I quite like having a bit of variety. Now the patch I started with was actually driven from Evo as the main oscillator, as the carrier. So this is itself oscillating. And this time we can take the sine output from Lorelei into the other CV input for the cutoff. And by switching in these octaves, vary the tone quite a bit. This octave switching makes Lorelei a really useful modulating oscillator for FM. I've also been using it with the through 0 EN129 over here from Danny Sound. It sounds great for that. You can dial in a nice ratio and then you can instantly switch up and down an octave with this octave switch, as you're hearing now. And this way around it works better at these kind of low ratios, especially for these kind of techno-y sounds. And again, you can run this through the VCA. For a more dynamic effect, and this is what I was kind of building to in that first patch. Just slam a kick drum underneath this, sidechain it, and you've got an instant kind of techno pan. So there you go, a few different flavours of FM with these two modules. Okay, Okay, so next I want to do a patch that uses Beatrix as a kind of complex filter for white noise to create some percussion. So I've got a couple of different sequences coming out of Pamela's new workout. This is just a Euclidean trigger pattern, trigger an envelope in stages, which is opening the VCA. I've got just the white noise output from the Turing machine just as a noise source here. Just going straight into into Beatrix, out of there into Persephone, and then straight out. This is what it sounds like at the moment. It's just a very short envelope. I've got a second trigger pattern here, which I'm using for some accents. So I'm going to use the second CV input here. And that'll just accentuate some of the notes. I've just got that on an offbeat kind of hit. And then I've got another trigger pattern, a different Euclidean pattern, which I'm going to use to modulate the decay time on the envelope, just to give us some kind of open, couple of different lengths. We've got like a kind of closed and open hi-hat. Now if I bring up the phaser depth, bring up the resonance, I've got quite a nice range of tone shaping here to tune in the kind of hi-hat sound to where we want it. Let's bring it up a little bit. I'm just going to take this looping function from contour 1, basically an LFO, take that into the offset. So that won't move the resonant peak, but it'll move the other notches in the frequency response, which gives us quite a nice little kind of subtle sweep. And let's just use the preamp and Persephone to dirty that up a little bit more as well. Okay, so to finish off on this video, I'm going to run a digital oscillator, in this case the Plum Audio Roved, the one-year version of Platts. I'm going to run that through Evo, Beatrix and Persephone just to bring a bit of analog warmth from these units to a digital oscillator. So on its own, the sound I'm going to be using to start with is from the chord model. Sounds like this, quite a nice chord. I'll just play with the wavetable slightly. Pretty static. So if I take that and run it through the little signal chain I've got set up here, I've got a bit of filtering with a slow LFO on the filter cutoff, a bit of resonance, then that's going through the phaser, again with an LFO to the phaser frequency, a bit of resonance there as well. Instantly a bit more movement. Let's just try a slightly more harmonically rich table here. And let's just bring this down to below the threshold on the bias there. And now if I play this little sequence, that's just about it for this video. Well done if you made it this far, it's been quite a long one. Just going to leave you with some final thoughts. I think these 4 modules collectively have been a really useful addition to my case. Some great sounds to be coaxed out of them and some really fantastic functionality too. Lorelei as an oscillator has got some really unique wave shaping, and that cross-modulation input opens up a whole palette of sounds I don't really have anywhere else. One thing I would have quite liked to have seen was an LFO mode, given the complexity of those wave shapes, and through 0FM would have been nice too, but you can't really argue with the price point. As for Evo, the filter, really solid 2-pole and 3-pole modes, having the resonant self-oscillating 2-pole modes pretty rare in Eurorack. Again, I would have quite liked to have seen high-pass and band-pass modes, but given the price point and how great it sounds as a low-pass filter, hard to argue with it really. Persephone, the VCA, I really think that zero crossing functionality is a bit of a game changer. It's going to be indispensable for me, and I think couple that with the overdrive and the tone shaping capabilities too, and it's an all-round total star performer. And finally, Beatrix, really solid phaser. If you're after a phaser effect, hard to really argue with it given the price again. Lots of modulation inputs, really smooth, clean sound. So leave a comment if you've enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I'll be back again soon, and in the meantime, thanks for watching.